I never believed in urban legends. Growing up, I heard countless stories, especially from my abuela, about La Llorona, the weeping woman who wanders the earth, searching for her lost children. The story was a way to keep us kids in line, to stop us from wandering near the river. I brushed it off as a bedtime tale, a myth that held no weight in reality. That is, until I experienced it myself. Last year, I moved to a small town near the border, not far from the Rio Grande. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what I needed after the chaos of the city. I rented a small house that overlooked the riverbank, thinking it would be a serene retreat. But from the very first night, things felt off. At first, it was subtle. The sound of flowing water seemed louder than it should have been, even though the river wasn't particularly close. Sometimes, I'd hear a faint whisper in the wind, something that almost sounded like crying. But it was always late at night, when the world was still, and I'd convince myself it was just my imagination. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a walk down to the river. The sun had set, casting a dim glow over the horizon, and a heavy fog began to creep in from the water. As I approached, the air grew colder, sharper, biting into my skin. I should have turned back, but curiosity, or maybe something else, pulled me closer. I reached the riverbank, and for a moment, everything was silent. No rustling trees, no distant traffic, just complete, unsettling quiet. That's when I heard it. A low, mournful wail, carried on the wind. It wasn't distant. It was right there, beside me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the foggy landscape. And then I saw her. A figure stood at the water's edge, her long, dark hair hanging wet around her pale face. Her white gown clung to her body, soaked through as if she had just risen from the river. She was weeping softly, her hands reaching out toward the water as if searching for something or someone. La Llorona! The words slipped from my lips before I could stop myself. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes, hollow and dark, locked onto mine. The crying stopped. I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the ground as she began to glide toward me, her feet never touching the earth. Her sorrowful expression twisted into something more sinister, more angry. The stories were true. Every word my abuela had whispered to me in my youth flashed through my mind. La Llorona was real, and she was here.
Mis hijos. ¿Dónde están mis hijos?
Her voice echoed, cold and despairing, as she moved closer. I took a step back, then another, but she followed. My legs refused to work properly, and I stumbled as she closed the distance between us. Her hand reached out, cold and clammy, brushing my arm. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, like her grief was seeping into my bones. I don't know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper, her face contorted with rage.
Mis hijos. ¿Dónde están mis hijos?
I turned and ran. My body felt sluggish, as if the fog was pulling at my limbs, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't stop until I was back inside my house, slamming the door behind me. For hours I sat in the dark, listening. Her wails echoed outside, haunting, relentless. I prayed, something I hadn't done in years, hoping the sound would fade, that she would leave. But the crying never stopped. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care about breaking the lease or retrieving the few belongings I'd left behind. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk seeing her again. I've since moved far away from the river, far from any place where the legend of La Llorona might find me. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I can still hear her crying. And I know she's searching for me. Months passed, and I tried to put that night behind me. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy, and I moved in with my girlfriend, Elena, in a new city. The memories of La Llorona had begun to fade, though not entirely. The terror I felt that night would always be etched in my mind, but I convinced myself it was a one-time experience. Until she came back. One evening, while Elena and I were watching TV, the sound of flowing water caught my attention. We didn't live anywhere near a river, so it was strange. At first, I thought it was the plumbing, but the sound grew louder and louder. It was the same rushing water I had heard near the Rio Grande. I stiffened in my seat, my heart sinking into my stomach. "Did you hear that?" I asked, glancing nervously at Elena. "Hear what?" she responded, looking at me quizzically. I stood up, listening carefully. It was faint now, almost like a distant hum, but unmistakable. The crying began again, soft, mournful, just like before. I rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of anyone near our house, but I knew she was out there. "Elena, we need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" she asked, standing up, concern etched across her face.
La Llorona.
"She's here," I whispered, my hands shaking as I grabbed my car keys. "Elena, I've heard this before. I don't know how she found me, but we need to go now." Elena stared at me in disbelief, but the intensity in my voice must have convinced her. We grabbed our things, and as we stepped outside, I saw it. A puddle of water, murky, like the river, spread across the driveway, and standing at the end of the street, barely visible through the dim streetlights, was the figure of a woman. Her white gown was torn and drenched, her dark hair covering her face. "Elena, don't look," I shouted as I pulled her into the car. We sped away, but even as we drove, the crying followed us, growing louder, as if La Llorona was chasing the car. The temperature inside dropped, and the air smelled like the damp, decaying riverbank. "She won't stop," I whispered, glancing at Elena. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. "Why is she after you?" she asked, terrified. I don't know. I yelled in frustration, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "She's looking for her children. I didn't do anything, but somehow she's connected to me now." We drove for hours, not knowing where to go, how far to run. It didn't matter. The wails never faded. La Llorona was relentless, her sorrow and fury driving her to pursue me across any distance, across any place. She wanted something from me, something I couldn't give her. Now we're living in a motel, far from any water, but it hasn't stopped. Every night, just as I begin to drift off, I hear her. She's getting closer. I feel her presence like a cold breath on the back of my neck. Elena doesn't talk about it, but I know she hears it too. The despair in her eyes tells me everything. La Llorona is still searching, and I know, deep down, that she won't stop until she finds what she's looking for, or until she takes me. I'm running out of places to hide.